Welcome to The Debate, Mind Fortress, Defending Against Psychological Warfare. Today we analyze the ideas from the book, The Invisible Architect.
And we are looking at quite the blueprints today. We're dissecting a worldview that suggests our modern relationships, whether, in the boardroom or the living room, are not just messy, but are often meticulously choreographed performances where hidden manipulators hold all the strings.
It is a heavy premise, I'll admit, but the argument here is that we ignore this at our own peril. The core thesis is that, that many of us are living under these invisible chains, suffering an erosion of autonomy through gaslighting, emotional blackmail, and coercive control. The proposal is pretty radical, a complete restructuring of how we handle difficult people. It wants to move us from being passive victims to thrivers by adopting what are, frankly, military-grade psychological defense strategies.
Military grade is definitely the operative word there. I've read the material, and what I'm seeing is a proposal for a level of hypervigilance that I think borders on paranoia. I'm here to question whether this manipulator-proof mindset is actually a path to freedom, because if you treat every single conflict as psychological warfare and every difficult person as an architect of entrapment, you might just be building a very lonely prison for yourself.
I understand that reaction. It does sound intense. I get it. But I'm arguing that the methods we're about to discuss, specifically the taxonomy of manipulation and the defenses against it, are absolutely essential survival tools. We live in a world that is just, rife with covert aggression. The argument is that without these definitions, we're basically fighting blind.
And I'm arguing that while the threats are certainly real, the proposed cure, this constant, rigorous auditing of every human connection, might actually be worse than the disease.
Okay, well, let's test that theory. I want to start with the foundational concept that's presented, the silent game.
Right, this is the pre-abuse phase, the setup stage?
Exactly. The idea is that before any shouting starts, before the overt abuse, there's this subtle, pervasive erosion of your reality. You walk into a room, a comment is made that undermines your achievement, maybe a backhanded compliment about how lucky you are to have a job you're clearly qualified for, and you feel this tiny discordant note. The material argues that most of us just ignore the signal. We chalk it up to our own sensitivity or, them having a bad day.
Which is a very human thing to do. We give people the benefit of the doubt. If we analyzed every single discordant note in a conversation, we'd never get through a dinner party.
But the counter-argument is that this benefit of the doubt is exactly where the trap is laid. The initial manipulation recognition checklist is proposed here as a countermeasure. It asks us to treat things like constant self-doubt, emotional exhaustion, and unwanted obligations not as personal failings, but as data points. It's a shift from, I'm being too sensitive, to, wait, my body is registering a threat.
Okay, I don't dispute that those feelings are real indicators of some kind of friction. But let's look at the initial action plan it proposes to deal with them. Step 2 is journal your observations. It explicitly says to focus on facts, not just feelings, and to record specific interactions, times, dates. When we start telling people that the solution to relationship friction is to keep a literal dossier on their friends and family, aren't we just coaching them to adopt a litigious mindset? You're preparing for a trial, not a conversation.
See, I don't think it's litigious. It's diagnostic. And this is a really crucial distinction. Without these records, people remain sort of anonymous in their own lives. They're unwitting subjects in psychological experiments they didn't consent to. If you are dealing with someone who operates by this manipulator's blueprint, someone driven by a high need for control and a very low capacity for empathy, your memory is their first target. They rely on you for getting the details. So collecting data isn't an act of aggression. It's an act of reclaiming your own agency.
This manipulator's blueprint, it assumes a level of intent that I find questionable in just everyday life. The source describes these architects as having a distorted sense of entitlement and viewing others as, merely as instruments.
Sure.
Sociopaths exist. I'm not denying that. But if you apply this framework to your mother-in-law who is just pushy or your boss who is just stressed, you risk pathologizing normal human friction. You stop seeing a flawed person and start seeing a master manipulator. Does building an impenetrable fortress around your reality actually protect you, or does it just make you impossible to connect with?
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it minimizes the stakes. We are not talking about friction. We're talking about the silent game, where the objective is power. If you're constantly second-guessing your own sanity, that isn't friction, that's the prelude to psychological erasure. And that brings us to the first major mechanism we need to debate: gaslighting. Specifically, this concept of the gaslight tango.
Yeah, gaslight tango. It's a catchy term for a miserable dynamic.
It is accurate, though. For our listeners who might just know the buzzword, the definition here is very specific. It describes a dance where the victim, who is desperate for clarity, inadvertently validates the manipulator just by trying to prove their own sanity. They go through 3 specific stages: disbelief, defense, and finally, depression.
Right. So you start by saying, that didn't happen. Then you argue, no, here's proof it happened. And finally, you just give up and accept their version because you're too exhausted to keep fighting.
Precisely. And the argument here is that you cannot win this dance. You can't reason your way out of a reality that is being actively denied. The only way out, according to this framework, is external validation and documenting reality. You cannot trust your memory when it is under attack. You need an external record, hence the journal.
I accept the diagnosis. The gaslight tango is a very real phenomenon where you're trying to explain yourself to someone who is committed to misunderstanding you. But I take issue with the efficiency of the proposed cure. I mean, if you are in a relationship where you need to keep a digital log of conversations, which is the specific suggestion, by the way, creating a searchable database of insults, isn't the relationship already dead?
Not necessarily. And even if it is dying, the victim often doesn't know it yet.
But think about the energy that consumes. You come home, you have an argument, and instead of processing it or sleeping on it, you're opening a spreadsheet to log the time, the date, the specific phrasing of the insult. I worry that spending all that energy documenting the fog of confusion actually keeps the victim trapped in the analysis. You're studying the cage instead of just walking out the door.
That's a fair critique of the effort involved. But you are assuming the victim can just walk out the door. And this is the crucial insight. Often, the gaslighting has eroded their confidence so thoroughly that they don't believe they are capable of leaving. They think they are the problem. The documentation provides the objective proof, the sanity check, that allows them to see the pattern. It shifts the narrative from "I am crazy" to "No, this is happening." That cognitive shift is the prerequisite for leaving.
So you see the journal as a temporary bridge to the exit, not a permanent lifestyle choice?
Exactly. It's a tool for reclaiming your internal compass. Once you're out, you burn the journal. But gaslighting is often just the setup. The real hook comes from what is identified as the fog.
FOG, fear, obligation, and guilt. This was one of the stronger theoretical sections, I have to admit. The breakdown of emotional blackmailers it was sharp.
It's incredibly precise. The framework doesn't just say, oh, they make you feel guilty. It categorizes the attackers into a taxonomy. We have the punishers who use overt threats, do this or I leave. We have the self-punishers who threaten self-harm. If you leave me, I'll hurt myself. Then you have the sufferers who blame you for their health. You're giving me a heart attack with all your behavior. And finally, the tantalizers who just offer false hope.
The sufferers are particularly insidious because they weaponize your own compassion right back at you.
They are. The argument is that these aren't just annoying personality traits, they are hostage situations. When a sufferer says, I'm so sick because of the stress you put me under, that is a weaponized statement designed to override your autonomy. It bypasses your logic and hits your empathy directly.
I don't deny the manipulation there. My concern is with the boundary-setting scripting that's proposed as the countermeasure.
How so?
Well, the advice is to respond to these high-emotion guilt trips with cold, scripted logic. For example, responding to "after all I've done for you" with a pre-planned phrase like "I appreciate what you've done, but my answer is still no." In a business negotiation, perfect. In a family dynamic, that feels robotic. It risks escalating the conflict because it signals a total withdrawal of empathy.
But isn't that the point? If your empathy is being weaponized against you, you have to withdraw it to survive. The sufferer relies on your empathy to control you. By using a script, you are refusing to engage in the emotional payoff that they're looking for. You're breaking the cycle. You're essentially putting up a sterile wall that their hook just can't grab onto.
Horace, you're confirming their narrative that you're cold and ungrateful. There's a nuance here I think is missed. Is eliminating all obligation and guilt actually healthy? We do have obligations to people we love. Sometimes guilt is a signal that we have messed up. This manipulator-proof approach seems to encourage a form of selfishness that's just disguised as self-care. It suggests that any demand on your time or emotion that you didn't pre-approve is an attack.
That is an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The material distinguishes between healthy influence and emotional blackmail. Healthy influence respects the word no. Blackmail punishes it. The scripts are for the latter. If you say no and the other person accepts it, well, you don't need the script. The script is the emergency brake. And this leads to the most controversial tactic in the entire arsenal: strategic disengagement. Specifically, the gray rock method.
Gray rock. For the listeners, this is the technique of making yourself as dull and unresponsive as a literal rock to bore the manipulator into leaving you alone.
It is presented as a safety measure against coercive control. The framework compares coercive control to an invisible prison built of micromanagement, financial restrictions. In that context, you can't just fight back overtly. That's actually dangerous. So radical disengagement, becoming uninteresting, is the key to the lock. You make yourself a bad target.
Okay, but I have deep reservations about the sustainability of gray rock. The text admits it requires immense energy and self-suppression. I mean, think about what we're asking a human being to do. To suppress their personality, their joy, their reactions, their spark, 24/7. It's essentially playing dead while you're still alive.
It's a survival strategy. It's not a lifestyle choice for a healthy environment. You do it until you can escape. It's camouflage in a war zone.
But the material suggests using it in co-parenting or unavoidable workplace interactions. That is a lifestyle. And there's a risk mentioned but sort of glided over: escalation. The hoovering or the rage that comes when a victim stops reacting.
And can you define hoovering for the audience?
Sure, it's like the vacuum cleaner. When the manipulator realizes you're pulling away or going gray rock, they try to suck you back in. They might suddenly become incredibly sweet, or they'll create a crisis to force you to react. My argument is that for many people, trying to out-manipulate a manipulator by acting boring is dangerous. It provokes the beast. You're changing the rules of the game without telling them.
It can provoke them, which is why safety planning is emphasized in the later sections. But consider the alternative. If you engage emotionally with a coercive controller, you're giving them fuel. Gray rock starves the fire. It's about strategic disengagement. It isn't passive. It's an active refusal to provide the emotional supply the manipulator craves. It's a way of saying, my inner world is no longer open for business.
I understand the logic, I really do. But it feels like a victory that costs you your soul. You win by becoming a shell. I would argue that standard conflict resolution or an immediate, messy exit, what's called no contact, is safer than living a double life where you pretend to be a zombie.
Well, no contact is ideal, and it is championed as the gold standard. But where that isn't possible, say, legally or financially, gray rock is the shield. But I want to pivot to how we get into these messes in the first place, the section on the confidence game.
This is where we start auditing our own cognitive biases, right?
Precisely. We are vulnerable because of things like rapport building, urgency, and social proof. The argument is that we're wired to be conned. We have these evolutionary blind spots.
Which is true. We're social animals. We want to believe the charming stranger likes us. We want to believe the deal is real.
So the defense proposed is the pause and process rule, a mandatory 24-hour wait on decisions, and a trust score impact checklist. This is a highly practical, high-efficiency tool to counter our own confirmation bias.
We want to believe the charming new person is wonderful, so we ignore red flags. The checklist forces us to actually look at the data.
The trust score impact checklist, I found this part honestly a little chilling.
Chilling? I'd say it's rigorous. It's basic due diligence for your heart.
But it suggests deducting points for rapid idealization or boundary testing. So you meet someone new, there's a spark. Maybe they move a little fast because they're excited, and you're sitting there mentally docking them 3 points on their trust score. It feels robotic. If we treat every new connection as a potential con artist, effectively auditing them for trust scores, we destroy the spontaneity of human connection. You're dating like an insurance adjuster.
I completely disagree. Rapid idealization is a classic hallmark of the love bombing phase. It feels like magic. We're soulmates. I've never met anyone like you, but it is so often a trap. The trust score isn't about killing romance, it's about protecting yourself from falling in love with a mask. The question asked is, do you trust your gut feeling? But the warning is that our gut can be hacked. The checklist is the firewall.
But a firewall blocks everything. That's my recurring issue with this entire philosophy. A manipulator-proof life sounds safe, yes, but it also sounds sterile. You're scrutinizing every compliment, journaling every argument, scripting every rejection, and scoring every new friend. You might be safe from manipulation, but are you open to intimacy? Intimacy requires vulnerability, and this entire mindset views vulnerability as a security breach.
I see it differently. True intimacy can only exist between two sovereign individuals. If invisible chains are pulling at you, you aren't intimate, you're enmeshed. The manipulator-proof life isn't about isolation, it's about unyielding personal agency and the power of no. You build a fortress so you can choose who to let in, rather than having your doors kicked down. It's about being the architect of your own life, rather than the building material for someone else's.
But the walls are so high. The method talks about reclaiming your reality by essentially creating your own closed loop of validation. You check your journal, you check your therapist, you check your boundaries. It's a very solitary form of truth.
It's a necessary correction. We're discussing people who have had their reality hijacked. The external validation from trusted allies is the opposite of solitary. It's about building a team reality to counter the team gaslight.
Okay, I will concede that for someone in the labyrinth, someone who is currently drowning in a toxic dynamic, these tools are lifelines. The identification of fog, the awareness of gaslighting, the permission to disconnect, that is absolutely vital.
It's more than vital. It's the difference between being a victim and a thriver.
But for the general population, or for someone who's recovering, I worry this creates a permanent wartime mentality. It suggests that the world is just populated by these invisible architects plotting your entrapment. Most people are just messy, insecure, and flawed. Treating them like masterminds might make us feel powerful, but it also makes us incredibly lonely.
And I would argue that underestimating the architecture of entrapment is exactly what allows it to persist. We don't need to be at war to be prepared, we just need to know where the exits are.
So what we have is a rigorous blueprint for defense, but a clear disagreement on whether we should live our entire lives behind the walls of a fortress.
I think that's a fair summary. The question isn't whether the walls work, they clearly do. The question is when it's safe to lower the drawbridge.
Exactly, and that is the nuance we hope you all take away.
We have analyzed the silent game, the fog, and the gaslight tango. We've looked at the trust scores and the gray rock. The invisible architect offers a heavy arsenal for a psychological battlefield.
It does. And while I suggest handling these weapons with care lest you hurt yourself, I cannot deny that they are sharp.
We leave you with this final question from the source material. Are you ready to audit the invisible chains in your life, even if it means seeing your relationships as a battlefield?
Or does seeing the battlefield create the war?
That is for you to decide. This has been The Debate.